Hello and welcome to Subject to Change with me, Russell Hogg. My guest today is Tony Christie. Tony has a blog called The Renaissance Mathematicus, where he writes about the history of science, and in particular about science during the Renaissance. And the blog's fantastically readable, and it's also extremely rigorous. So if you have any interest in science or in the history of the Renaissance, I really urge you to seek it out. And, I'm just not sure there's anything quite like it out there. It's really, really remarkable, and do please seek it out. So welcome, Tony, to the podcast.
Thank you, Russell. Thank you for inviting me onto your podcast. I'm not quite sure how this is going to go, so we'll just see.
Well, look, so maybe the best thing to do is to maybe talk a little bit about your blog. What is the project that you've undertaken there, and what's your approach or your philosophy or whatever you would call it in writing history of science?
To some extent, it's all a bit accidental. I got interested in history of mathematics when I was 16. My father gave me Eric Temple Bell's Men of Mathematics because I was good at mathematics at school, which is an incredibly inspiring book, but historically an incredibly bad book. Got hooked and have been teaching myself history of maths, history of science ever since. I didn't actually formally start studying it till I became a mature student, age of 30. I went to university in Germany just after I moved to Germany. And I started originally studying mathematics with philosophy as a subsidiary, and then changed to philosophy with English literature and history, and basically doing history and philosophy of science with some very, very good people. My professor, who's still a very good friend of mine, although he's getting on for 90 now, is a big expert on the history of formal logic. And I got involved in a research project into the history of formal logic, which is basically my apprenticeship as a, if you will, professional historian of science. And the thing is that Thiel, my professor, is very accurate, very pedantic, believes in getting things right, and believes in telling complete stories. It's interesting to note how he started. He was writing about Löwenheim, who's a German logician around the time of the First World War. There's a theory in logic which calls the Löwenheim-Skolem theory. Thiel, being German and being a pedantic, wanted to know the life and the birth and death dates of Löwenheim, and he couldn't find the death date. Most sources said approximately in 1945, and he went looking and found that what it was that Löwenheim was a Jew, he's German, and he disappeared, and people assumed that he'd been killed in a concentration camp. And this became gospel and got repeated. Löwenheim actually survived the war. He went to work in a Steiner school, sort of hid from the Nazis. And he actually died in 1955 in Berlin. And he'd been alive for 10 years after people were reporting him dead, and Thiel found this interesting and started looking at sort of facts in the history of logic. And an incredible amount of the sort of biographies and so forth are really bad. People sort of throw something together. That's how I learned to do history of science, is getting things right, getting the context right, getting the facts right. I dropped out before I finished my degree for health reasons, but carried on teaching myself history of science, history of maths, discovered the internet about 15 years ago, and science blogs. Started commenting on a couple of science blogs, and people were saying, "Oh, your comments are interesting. Why don't you write something bigger?" And finally, I plunged. And then John Wilkins, who used to run a very nice blog on history and philosophy of biology, said I should start blogging for myself. So I set up a blog, not really knowing what was going on or what I was doing, but the basic principle being trying to get the context right and trying to get the facts right.
What do you mean when you say trying to get the context right? What do you mean by the context?
People take things out of context. And a typical bias, if we ignore Galileo from it, we look at Newton. Amongst professional historians, it's very different. But on the popular level, people sort of wave away Newton. Newton had an incredible interest in Bible studies, in religion, in alchemy. And these are all part of his whole philosophy of science. And he approached them all in the same way. And people try and sort of dismiss this and sort of say, well, we've got Newton, a scientist, on the one side, and we've got this other Newton. We're not interested in him. But in fact, if you want to understand Newton and what he's doing, the bits people aren't interested in are very, very important. there are a whole lot of people researching this these days. So some of them read my blog, who I know. Newton is presented, as is Galileo, as a lot of other people, of coming out of nowhere and coming with brilliant ideas. Yeah? But he's actually building on an incredible amount of work that other people have done who don't get mentioned, as did Galileo, as did Kepler, as did almost everybody. It's very rare for somebody to come out of nowhere and produce something original and stunning. And one of my favorite philosophers of science is a guy called Imre Lakatos. And he does a paraphrase of a quote from Kant. Philosophy of science without history of science is blind, and I can't remember the exact. And history of science without philosophy of science is useless or whatever. And the problem is, it's rather like Munchausen. You need history of science to do philosophy of science, and you need philosophy of science to do history of science. And the third stage, and the one that's most important to me, is the so-called is what I term the mythology of science, which is what most people accept is the history of science. If you look at the popular books and the popular magazine articles and all the rest of it, about a large part of what they put in them are myths. They're not facts. They're not real history. What I try to do is, I'm a synthesist. I don't do any original research. I've done original research in my life, but I don't do any original research. I use other people's research. I synthesize. I try to popularize. I try to make the stuff approachable for non-historians, non-experts. But what I try to present is, as near as possible, the correct historical facts and the correct context in which these facts took place.
I think what's very difficult when you're looking back at history is to try to understand what the people knew at the time, because we live in a world which knows, well, we think we know a huge amount, and it's very hard to go back into the mind of, say, somebody at 1500 who didn't know that the Pacific Ocean existed, for example. It's just very hard to imagine a world where
the people who lived in the Pacific, the people who lived
in the Pacific knew there was the Pacific.
Now, well, this is the next problem. We have a very Eurocentric approach. English-speaking people have a very Eurocentric approach to the history of science. They talk about Vasco da Gama being the first European to arrive in India. Europeans have been going to India since the time of the Greeks and the Romans. They go across the Indian Ocean. They don't go around Africa. There is an established route. The Pacific has a population of people who are very, very good navigators, who have a lot of star knowledge, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We make this mistake of thinking we are the middle of the world. We aren't. We are just one little island swimming on the edges of the Atlantic. People in 1500 not knowing that the Pacific existed. My favorite example, and I have this argument with lots of self-appointed atheist historians talking about, which is something we will come to, acceptance of heliocentric view of the world rather than a geocentric one. Try using the knowledge that was available in 1600 and the instruments and what have you that were available in 1600, try to prove that the world moves. You can't. It's as simple as that. You can't. And that was the big problem.
Well, okay, let's talk about heliocent, and let's just go back to, and probably they aren't the founding systems, but you've got the astronomical systems of Ptolemy and and of Aristotle. So do you want to say a bit about what they were and how they had developed and how people saw them around about the time just prior to Galileo? Is that too big a subject, or is that okay?
I would actually go back further. I go back to what I regard as probably the beginning of people's interest in astronomy, cosmology. And it's something that most people today aren't very aware of because we have so much light pollution. But I used to live out in the mountains, about 30 kilometers away from any cities. They turn off the streetlights at 11 o'clock at night. And if you go out in the middle of the night in summer, there is a sky that you wouldn't believe. Most people have never seen this. And this was the sky that people saw. If you go far enough back in history, you have to imagine somebody laying in the middle of a field or a clearing in a forest and just looking up at the sky. And you've got this incredible, apparently infinite number of stars. And if you lay there all night, they move. And they move as a block. And they go around in a circle. People found this fascinating and they kept watching it. And at some point, they realized that there are a few very bright ones that don't go with the block. And they go in the other direction. It's what we call the planets. Early cultures identified them. And one of the things that all cultures do, and it's almost universal, is they start thinking about, does that up there, it's so impressive, it's so massive, does it have an influence? Does it have an influence on me? Does it have an influence on my life? This is the start of astrology, and astrology comes before astronomy. People start doing astronomy looking for patterns in these movements to try and determine how this influence works. And in terms of European astronomy, the first people who are actually outside of Europe, it's the Babylonians. And you're going back probably to about 3000 BCE. The Babylonians start doing fairly serious astronomy. It's very different to what we understand under astrology today. It develops over the time. They get more and more accurate in their determination of the movement of these rather strange stars that go in the wrong direction. They developed, the Babylonians developed a fairly sophisticated mathematics for civil reasons. They had a central state. All goods, all harvests and so forth belonged to the state, and they were gathered in and then divided up and so forth. So they developed algebra, arithmetic and algebra. And they applied this to their astronomy, to their astrology. They worked out algebraic algorithms to track the planets and also to track the occurrence of lunar eclipses and solar eclipses. They were pretty good on the lunar eclipses, but solar eclipses is a problem because there is a model when solar eclipses should occur, but because of a slight hitch in the system, they don't. They don't always. So the Babylonians could say there ought to be one. They couldn't for certain say there is going to be one. And these became very important astrologically, lunar eclipses, solar eclipses. And all of this, the ancient Greeks inherited.
Yep.
Around 500 BCE, the Greeks come on the scene, take over this. They developed the astrology that we now know, and their motivation is also astrology. Yeah, this is what they're doing.
The thing people say about the Greeks is that they were interested less in the gods and more they were interested in explanations that didn't require gods to make them work. Is that slightly misleading?
I find this a very dubious statement. If you look at Plato, I mean, the demiurge. I mean, this makes all talks about gods look rational. You know, I mean, it's sort of it's 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. They're not really. They do have a logical, rational system of what we would now call science, but it's embedded in an incredible amount of mythology, and they're very much, very, very, very much into astrology. And for them, and for the Babylonians, and for the Greeks, astrology is a science. It's rational.
Yeah.
Do not make the mistake of thinking it's occult, it's rubbish or anything. For them, it's rational, and they are trying to work out the logic, the rationality of astrology, and they invest a lot of time doing astronomy in order to do their astrology. The Greeks don't have an algebra. They're not interested in algebra. They develop a geometrical system, and they plot the planets geometrically. You get a guy who's earlier than Plato, a guy called Empedocles, who comes up with all of these sort of cosmological things that the planets, and planets is a Greek word, it means wanderer. For the Greeks, everything in the sky is a star, astra. They have the fixed stars, our stars. They have the wandering stars, the planets, planete is wanderer. And they have the hairy stars, which is comets. So they're all stars. And they have various sort of functions. Empedocles came up with the various things that sort of the planets move in circles with uniform speed, so the uniform circular motion. It's also Empedocles, the Greek system of elements goes back to Empedocles. Plato adopts all of this, and the ones about the planets become known as the Platonic axioms. A guy called Eudoxus, who may have been slightly before Plato, he may have been slightly after. There are various arguments in both directions. Developed a system of so-called homocentric spheres, because you have a problem. The planets don't go in circles. If you follow the outer planets, if you follow Mars or Jupiter or Saturn, they can't see others. They appear to go across the sky in one direction, and then at some point they stop. and then they go back for a bit in the other direction, and then they stop again and go back to the original direction. And what it is you can explain it in a heliocentric system, and this is exactly what Copernicus did, is they are going around the sun, the Earth is going around the sun, and it's the overtaking maneuver.
Right.
So the apparent movement of the two, the Earth is moving, the planet is moving. When they pass each other, you get this sort of what is called retrograde motion. So the cosmology says they go around in perfect circles. The astronomy, the observations say they don't. So you have to find a way of solving this problem. The other thing is that the circles all have the same center, and the center is the Earth. And this is where the term homocentric comes from, the same center. Homo is same and center. Eudoxus produces a system for each planet of nested spheres. The planet is somewhere out on the outer sphere. The one sphere moves in that direction, the other one moves in that direction. It's rather like a cardanic joint. Yeah, you're doing this, you can basically reproduce the movement of the planets. And somebody else, whose name escapes me at the moment, developed a more sophisticated version of this. And this is what Aristotle, who comes along now as a student of Plato's, he takes over this homocentric model. And he builds in a sort of friction drive in that the spheres are nested on each other and they sort of rub against each other so that the movement are all interconnected. And the only thing that's really moving for the Greeks, and for the Babylonians as well, for the stars are also on a sphere, and this is the sphere of the fixed stars. If you actually look up at the sky, it looks like that. There's a dome. Right? If you go somewhere where there's no light pollution and it's a clear night, it's a dome. And even the Egyptians who were flat earthers, the Babylonians were also flat earthers, they say there's a dome. You have the dome of the heavens. Aristotle had this system where the one that moves is this sphere of the stars. And through this sort of friction drive, it drives all the other spheres. And in order to build this system, he had 57 spheres for 7 planets. The Earth is not a planet. The Earth is in the middle and doesn't move. You have Mercury, Venus, Mars, the Sun, Jupiter, Saturn, the fixed stars out the back. The Sun is a planet.
So, sorry, what's the difference between geocentrism and?
Well, we'll come to that. So this is a geocentric system. The Earth is at the middle, unmoving, so it's geostatic, geocentric, and everything is revolving around the Earth in circles, except it isn't. But the nested sphere system gives you the variations in the movements. The spheres revolve around the Earth as its center. Aristotle is not an astronomer, he's a cosmologist, he's a philosopher. So his system is not an astronomical system. He believes in astrology. It's Aristotle who somewhere in his philosophy produces this thing as above, so below. So what is going up in the heavens is being mirrored on the Earth. And this is the fundamental philosophical justification for astrology. Interesting, the Chinese have a similar belief. So in Chinese philosophy, the kingdom of heaven is mirrored through the kingdom of earth. So you have the same concept in another civilization. And so Aristotle has this geocentric system with his spheres. He also brings in something which is based on Empedocles' element system. There are 4 elements: fire, air, earth, water, and the Earth consists just of these 4 elements. And everything below the orbit of the moon, I've got the moon before. The moon is one of the planets, of course. Everything below the orbit of the moon consists of the 4 elements. And everything above the orbit of the moon consists of a 5th element, which gets called the ether. That's where the origin of the word ether is. It's also the quintessence, the 5th quin, essence.
Oh, I see.
It's where the word quintessence comes from.
Oh, interesting.
What is on the Earth is changes, dies, corrupts. What is above is perfect, never changes. And perfect motion is circular motion, the planets. And imperfect motion on the Earth is gravity, up and down. And violent motion is anything which isn't one of those. So if you throw something, this is violent motion. Change is very important. Movement is change. Plants growing and dying is change. So all of this is central to, and change is one thing by Aristotle. So plants growing and dying and movement are basically philosophically the same. But we won't go down that street. But anyway, so Aristotle...
It is interesting. It is interesting.
Aristotle sets up this whole system. He has a theory of cosmology. He has a theory of astronomy, which he's taken over from Eudoxus. He has a theory of matter and elements and the difference between superlunar and sublunar and all the rest of it. And he has a physics of movement. Perfect movement above doesn't need any explanation. Movement below, he then produces projectile motion and all the rest of it and gets it all wrong. This is important because Galileo is one of the people who gets it right. And it's all a big integrated system. And what's interesting is where does this movement come from? It's God who is outside of the sphere of the stars, but it's not God in Aristotle's terms. It's the unmoved mover, whatever that is. If you ask Aristotle what produces the movement, it's funny enough. I only discovered this a few years ago. It's where the cliche comes from. It's love makes the world go round.
Is that actually
the driving force of the universe is love? No. The expression "love makes the world go round" is actually Aristotle's explanation of what drives this whole 57-sphere friction drive system. Believe it or not, I mean, this is
fantastic. It's fantastic.
This is real. So the problem is there are aspects of the planetary motion and appearance which can't be explained by the Eudoxus sphere, in homocentric sphere model, and so the mathematician Apollonius comes up with a different system of planetary movement, which is based on two possible things: excentra, which means that the middle of the circle of movement of the planet is not the Earth, it's excentra, or he uses the what we call the epicycle deferent model. And the epicycle is a circle that is centered on the Earth, and the planet doesn't sit on this circle, but sits on a small circle, which is the deferent, which is on the epicycle and also revolves.
So it's a circle sitting on a circle.
Circle sitting on a circle. And this is I think Apollonius himself or somebody else proved that the two systems are mathematically equivalent. And what survives is the epicycle deferent model. This gets used by Hipparchus and then taken on by Ptolemy. And Ptolemy is I'm going to use the English word Ptolemy. I prefer the Latin Ptolemeus, which the Germans use. One can also call him in Greek Ptolemaios. But for some reason in English, he becomes Ptolemy. Ptolemy lives sometime around the middle of the 2nd century CE, our time. He is an absolutely incredible, to use an anachronism, scientist. He writes on a whole range of topics on optics, music harmony, astronomy, astrology, geography, cartography, and so forth and so forth. He produces what is now known in English as the Almagest, which is actually the Arabic name for it. It's the Syntaxis Mathematicae in Greek, which is a vast mathematical astronomy book. It's geocentric, and it uses the epicycle deferent model to explain the movement of the planets. It also has very strong arguments in it against a heliocentric system in which the Earth goes around the sun, which had been proposed by Aristarchus of Samos. Without much success, there's only one person who actually took up Aristarchus's suggestion.
When you say it has strong arguments, does he actually address it head on, or does he?
Yes, he addresses it head on. There's a whole section of the Syntaxis Mathematicae where he deals with this, the arguments. The arguments are fairly rational. If the Earth is moving, it's something I ask people to think about. If the Earth is moving, how fast is a point on the equator moving? Do you know?
Moving, do you mean spinning?
If the Earth is spinning on its axis, how fast is a point on the equator moving?
Gosh, it's 20,000 miles round, something like, is it?
We do it in kilometers. We're scientists. We do it in kilometers.
40,000 kilometers, it goes round in a day, so 40,000 kilometers a day. Is that right? I have no idea. It's beyond me.
Yeah, it's 40,000 kilometers a day. It's actually 1,600 kilometers an hour. My example when I do lectures on this, I say, well, imagine you're sitting on a motorbike and you accelerate to 100 kilometers an hour. Not 1600, just 100 kilometers an hour. Now sit upright and open a newspaper.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah. Yeah.
You can't. I mean, it's physically impossible. So if the Earth is moving at the equator at a speed of 1600 kilometers an hour, why isn't everything getting blown away? If you fire an arrow or a cannonball or whatever across the movement of the Earth, why does it go in a straight line and not, yeah, and why do birds not get left behind if the Earth is moving? And there's a whole series of very rational arguments. The solution is very simple, and Copernicus actually suggests it, that there is a sort of envelope around the Earth which travels with the Earth, and everything is contained within the envelope. This is actually the truth.
That's the air, right?
Try proving it. Yeah, this is what physics in the 17th century is about, is actually proving this. The whole of 17th century physics is dedicated to proving this. So, like at the time of Aristoteles, or the time of Aristotle, or the time of Ptolemy, there's forget it. Yeah, right. There's no way. They don't even know what air is.
Yeah,
it's this substance. Yeah, what is it? So Ptolemy comes up with this vast book which explains all of it mathematically, and the whole point about it is what his book is intended to do is to provide astronomical data. When is this planet going to be where? When are there going to be lunar eclipses? When are there going to be solar eclipses? By then, they could explain solar eclipses properly, and so forth. And this is basically for astrology.
So your point is the problem they are solving is not necessarily what is the reality. It's what's going to happen. I'm solving an astrological problem, so I need to know where things are going to be and when.
The other point, what is important is always said, so there's this thing of Platonic thing of saving the phenomena, which comes from Duhem in the 19th century. As far as Ptolemy is concerned, it's rubbish. Ptolemy actually believed in his system. He thought it was real. And that's very obvious when you read the Almagest. Even more so if you read his cosmology, which disappeared. There is only one manuscript of it in Arabic, which was discovered in the 1960s. There were bits of it known, and it was known that he'd written one, but it's just one of these things that got lost. So he produces this thing in about 150 CE. He also produces the definitive book on astrology, called the Tetrabiblos, 4 books. And in the Tetrabiblos, he actually says the science of the stars consists of 2 parts. The first part says where they go, where they're to be found, and that's his Almagest. And the second part explains their influence. That's the Tetrabiblos. So for him, and it's just one science with 2 aspects. And he actually uses the word astrology, not astronomy. It's only the first person to use astronomy and astrology in the way that we use them is Isidore in the 6th century CE. For people like astronomy, there's just one science. It's all the same. So he produces this, and it together with Aristoteles and all the rest of it, they all disappear around the 5th, 6th century CE with the collapse of the Roman Empire and all the rest of it. All of this stuff disappears. The only work that survives, which has to do with cosmology and so forth, is from Plato. And I'm just trying to think what it's called. It's not really important, but it is important because it influences in a bad way. Everything else disappears. So the first big myth is, if you read popular accounts, they say, and Ptolemy's model ruled only objection 1400 years until Copernicus came along. It didn't, because from about the 6th century to the 12th century, nobody knew about it in Europe. The Arabs did, but the Europeans didn't. The Arabs rediscovered it starting in the 8th century, 7th century, 8th century, but it didn't get to Europe till the 12th century. In the Middle Ages, what you do have is the work of a guy called Martianus Capella, who's a late Roman, 5th century. And he has an interesting system. He has a system which is a geocentric system, in which the planets all go around the Earth, except for Mercury and Venus, which go around the Sun. And this is actually very obvious because Mercury and Venus never go very far away from the Sun. And you have this thing with Venus being the morning star and the evening star, because it disappears for a time, and then it appears on one side of the Sun, then it disappears and appears on the other side of the Sun. Depending on which side of the Sun it is, it's the morning star or the evening star. The way Martianus Capella writes about his system it's fairly obvious that he didn't invent it, that it existed, that it was considered. And this was very popular in the Middle Ages, and right down to the time of Copernicus and so forth. Well, Copernicus mentions it because it supports his heliocentric model.
Well, somewhat.
Yeah, it's planets that go around the sun. Yeah. It's nothing new to suggest that planets go around the sun. There's another thing which the Greeks had, which is from a guy called Heraclitus. I forget when he lived, but he's before BCE sometime, who suggested it's not the sphere of the stars, the fixed sphere of the stars doesn't rotate, the Earth does. So we have diurnal rotation, Earth spinning on its axis. And his argument is actually a physical argument. The sphere of the stars is thought to be real. It's solid. It's there. It's vast in comparison to the size of the Earth. And you require far less energy to rotate the Earth than you need to rotate, and he's not using the word energy, of course, than you need to rotate the sphere of the stars. And this model keeps turning up. The Arabs discussed it. Various late medieval figures, Oresme and Nicholas von Cusa, discuss it. Again, this is another myth that there is only Ptolemy and then comes Copernicus. There are alternatives already in the game. The interesting one is that both Nicholas von Cusa and Oresme say, well, the Heraclidean model is actually more rational and physically more plausible, but tradition says... Yeah, and exactly. They reject it on the grounds of tradition. Yeah. So the model is there, it's known, as is Martianus Capella's model is known. As I said, we come back amongst the Arabs. They had both the Ptolemaic model and the Aristotelian homocentric model. And there are Arabic astronomers, cosmologists who say that the Ptolemaic model doesn't fit the Platonic axioms because the planets do not revolve around the middle point, the Earth, the central point, the Earth. Sorry, I was drifting off into German, the Earth. So we have this thing. It gets more complicated because in order to get uniform motion, Ptolemy introduced all sorts of weird things like the center of rotation is not the Earth, it's a point away from the Earth. And the center of measurement is a point on the other side of the Earth, equally distanced to the center of rotation, the equine point. And if you measure, if the center of rotation is one side of the Earth and the center of measurement is the other side of the Earth, you actually get uniform circular motion for the planet. Yeah,
these guys were geniuses. I mean, this is extraordinary.
Yeah, Ptolemy is a brilliant mathematician. There's no doubt about that. He didn't invent the system. Apollonius is an absolutely brilliant mathematician, but he uses it and he develops this thing of the equine point and so forth. Of course, this doesn't fit the so-called Platonic axioms, the Empedocles thing. The Earth is no longer at the center. The planets are not all, because each one has its own movement point and measuring point. They're not homocentric and all the rest of it. So you get an attempt to revive Aristotelian homocentric astronomy because they still maintain the Empedocles, Plato, Aristotelian cosmology. Although Ptolemy himself doesn't.
And by that you mean that everything is sort of...
It's homocentric, that it's uniform circular motion and all the rest of it. Yeah? So you have this thing in the Middle Ages when they both come back, and Ptolemy actually comes back earlier than Aristotle. You have this thing of, you have a cosmology from Aristotle and an astronomy from Ptolemy that don't fit together. They're contradictory.
Right. And
people just sort of live with it. We won't ask questions. But of course, it then happens in the Middle Ages, other European astronomers and philosophers start questioning Ptolemaic astronomy because they say it's not homocentric, it doesn't fit, it's not playing the game. So you got all of these sort of competing, and it becomes this sort of, the Christian church adopts this compromise, this sort of mix-up of Aristotle's cosmology with Ptolemy's astronomy. Ptolemy's astronomy, because it's a better one. I mean, it actually has better predictive power. But the other models, the Martianus Capella is still in the game. People are discussing Heraclides and diurnal rotation. So the whole thing is very much open. And what the people are very much aware of is that their data all comes from Ptolemy. He has this vast amount of data on which his mathematical model is based in his book. And this is what people are using. And this has, over more than 1,000 years of being copied, recopied, translated, retranslated, become incredibly corrupted. So it's very inaccurate. And planetary tables, which are tables worked out from the model and from the data, which are supposed to tell you when this planet is going to be where and when this lunar eclipse is going to occur and when this solar... These tables become very inaccurate. So moving on fairly rapidly into the 15th century.
But just before we do move on, can I just understand, why is the church involving itself in this at all?
Because the church is responsible for everything.
Right.
The church is literally, and this is something that people don't understand. They say, oh, the church shouldn't have interfered with Galileo. The church theology, if you're going to call it a science, theology is the science of everything.
Right.
Theology has the function to explain all of God's work. The cosmos is God's creation.
Yeah.
The church has no problems with this. They did have a problem. Augustinus, the most important of the early church fathers, had a problem with astrology. He was himself a practicing astrologer and knew that it worked. And he came to the conclusion, when he converted to Christianity and became a Christian, he came to the conclusion it could only work because it was based on the devil and evil. So he rejected astrology. And you get this famous quote, which people always get wrong. They say that Augustine disliked mathematics because he talks about the mathematici. But a mathematici is an astrologer. And he's objecting to the astrologers, not to the mathematicians.
Right.
But when Aristotle came back into European thing in the 12th century, 13th century, Albertus Magnus and Thomas Aquinas, they could have rejected astrology. They could have said, well, Christianity has nothing to... Because Greek astrology is deterministic.
Right. No free will. You
are born and your fate is written in the stars. It's deterministic. Central tenet of Christianity is free will. So they contradict each other. Thomas Aquinas, Albertus Magnus reinterpreted astrology as non-deterministic. Instead of rejecting it, they said it works, we accept it, but it's non-deterministic. So they built it back into the system. So again, the main function of astronomy is to deliver data for astrology. People sort of say astrology, but it plays an incredibly important role in the whole history of this thing. This is what I mean about context.
Yeah,
there was a big tendency in earlier history to sort of sweep astrology under the carpet, but it's actually central. It's very central.
It's what they took for granted, so you can't sweep it away.
Oh, you can. I mean, people wrote whole histories of astronomy with ignoring astrology. I mean, it's sort of rather perverse.
But then you're just not understanding.
No, you're not. The motivation of and all the rest of it. It's all becomes very inaccurate because of corruption of manuscripts and all the rest of it. So starting in the middle of the 15th century, people start wondering how they can improve astronomy. The principal people here are Georg von Feuerbach, who was professor in the University of Vienna in the middle of the 15th century, and his most famous student, Johannes Müller, known popularly as Regiomontanus. They were both astronomers. They were both astrologers. Both of them served as court astrologers to various rulers. They started to look at an improved astronomy. And the first thing he did was Feuerbach got asked to produce a new translation from the original Greek of Ptolemy. He couldn't because he couldn't do Greek. But he knew Ptolemy off by heart. And what he started to write is his epitome, which is a sort of improved, streamlined, modernized version of the Almagest.
How is he doing this if he can't speak Greek?
Because he's doing it from Latin sources. He introduces new mathematics and stuff, and he died. The Almagest has 13 books, and he'd managed 6. He took over the task, and Regiomontanus went off with a Greek cardinal as his private librarian, book collector, what have you, learned Greek and finished off the epitome. This is a sort of updated, modernized, super efficient Almagest. It's still inaccurate because the data is still inaccurate.
I was going to ask, have they been checking the data? No, they haven't.
Not yet. Regiomontanus got asked, By this point, he's on the royal court in Budapest as court librarian. Why astrology doesn't work, why it's inaccurate. And he says, because astronomy is inaccurate. If astronomy was accurate, we could make accurate astrological forecasts. He gets permission from Corvinus, the king, to leave Budapest to go and modernize astronomy. And he moves to Nuremberg, which is where I live, or just down the road from where I live. He sets up the world's first scientific printing press. Literally, the world's first scientific printing press. The first thing he publishes is the lectures on cosmology from Feuerbach, which is a new astronomical thesis. What's interesting is it's actually the lost Ptolemaic cosmology. And obviously, Feuerbach had a copy of this.
Huh.
And what it is Ptolemy sets his epicycle different models inside spheres, inside shells, Eudoxian shells, so to speak. And Feuerbach does this. The epitome, he doesn't publish the epitome because he dies. He comes to Nuremberg in 1470 and he dies in 1476. And he only manages to publish 9 articles, 9 books, 8 books and a publishing list, what he intends to publish. He comes to Nuremberg because he wants to start a complete new observational program.
Right. Collect
new data. And he comes to Nuremberg for 2 reasons. One, they make the best scientific instruments in the world, which they did at the time. And 2, they have a very, very good post-service. Post-services then were based on trade, and Nuremberg is one of the major trading centers of Europe. And the only people who had a better postal service in Nuremberg was Venice, with whom Nuremberg traded an incredible amount. Regiomontanus was aware of the fact that he couldn't do this alone, and he needed to communicate with other astronomers in Europe, which meant he needed good communications. Mm-hmm. So, and we know this, he says it, why he comes to Nuremberg. It's exactly these 2 reasons. And he hardly gets started, and he dies. And he had a pupil, a guy called Bernhard Walter, who was a trader in Nuremberg, an amateur astronomer, who carries on a bit of the observational program, and that's about it. But he has this concept that we need to do it all from scratch. And he's the first one that says this. But shortly after his death, the epitome gets published.
And so what year are we talking about here?
We are talking, he dies in 1476.
Okay.
Shortly after his death, the epitome gets published in Venice. The lectures from Feuerbach on the epitome become the modern standard textbooks for astronomy. And they are the books that Copernicus uses. It's the books on which Copernicus learns his astronomy. Copernicus starts out as a Ptolemaic astronomer, and he uses and it's very obvious from the De Revolutionibus, his own book, that it is based on the epitome and not on the original Almagest.
Right. The new improved version.
Because the epitome has stuff in it which isn't in the Almagest, and it's very obvious that this is what Copernicus is referencing. So Copernicus, born 1472, somewhere around there, I can't remember. No, later than that. Goes off to university in Krakow, where he first starts learning astronomy. And Krakow was a major center for astronomy. Krakow was a major center for astrology, which means teaching astronomy. And it's because a guy who was in Budapest with Regiomontanus took all of Regiomontanus's manuscripts to Krakow. And so they are up to date. They are very modern in Krakow. And Copernicus is learning astronomy in Krakow. He then goes off to northern Italy. Copernicus is the son of a rich trader who dies when he's still a child, and his education is taken over by his uncle, who is a Catholic bishop. He becomes the Prince Bishop of Frombork, which is in Poland, and is a autonomous Prince Bishopric at the time of a small territory which is known as Warmia in Latin and Ermland in German. This Prince Bishop looks after his nephew, appoints him a canon of the cathedral in Frombork when he's still a teenager, so a sinecure. Copernicus then goes off to university in
Krakow.
After Krakow, he goes off to university in Italy, studies medicine, doesn't finish his medical studies, but takes a degree in law, This is not unusual at the time, yeah. It's sort of.
But I'm just very taken. There's just seems to be this intellectual ferment. All these little places doing, new stuff, and
There is.
everywhere.
There's a whole. There's a lot of other people in the 16th century, beginning of the 16th century. There is a whole lot of stuff going on all over the place, and they all know each other, and they're all communicating with each other. This idea that they're sort of isolated or whatever is complete rubbish. So Copernicus is studying this, and the big question comes up: why did he suddenly start thinking in terms of heliocentricity? That everything revolves around the sun and not around the Earth? And the simple answer is we have no idea. There are numerous suggestions, but none of them really is that convincing. They don't really add up. So Copernicus is teaching himself astronomy. He's learning astronomy from other people. By about 1510, he's back in Varmia. He's back being canon of the cathedral. He writes a little booklet, which is known by the title Commentariolus, which is a title he got from much later from Tycho Brahe. There are, I think, 2.5 surviving manuscripts of this thing. He writes a little booklet which outlines a heliocentric system. We know there was one copy in a library in Krakow in 1514 because it's mentioned.
Right.
We assume that what is mentioned is the Commentariolus. This gets distributed. We know it gets distributed because people talk about it. In it, he says, well, he's gonna write a book in which he's going to prove this, because there it's just a hypothesis.
Mm-hmm.
He's actually, as a canon of the cathedral, he's a civil servant. He's an administrator of the territory of Varmia, of Ermland, and he has various jobs. Amongst others, he defends Allenstedt, one of the towns in Varmia, during a war. No, it's because people think it's this guy sort of sitting in an ivory tower. I'm like,
Sure,
he's a busy administrator. His uncle is the Prince Bishop. He writes his book, which is De Revolutionibus, and it's basically it's a mirror copy of the Almagest, but written as a heliocentric system.
right.
So he's sort of saying, well, like, I respect Ptolemy, but got it wrong.
Yeah.
And he doesn't publish. And there's a lot of rubbish about him not publishing because he was scared of the church, because the church believes in the geocentric system, which the church did. But it's not, in fact, that. It's because he couldn't prove it.
Right.
He produces this mathematical model, which is consistent, which is interesting, but has absolutely no proof that the cosmos, the solar system, is a solar system, that it's heliocentric. He can't prove it. And he's well aware of this. And in his original Commentariolus, he said he would prove it. Yeah, so he's sort of... So then in 1538, a young guy called Georg Joachim Rheticus...
Sorry, what was his name?
Georg Joachim Rheticus.
Oh, Rheticus.
Rhetia is a Roman province in what is now Austria, and it's where he was born. And his original name was
They all take Latin names, don't they? They say,
well, they take humanist names, and they're often toponym, which means they are names based on the place where they're born, or where they live, or where they work. So Rheticus comes from Rhetrea, which is as I say, was the Roman name for the province in Austria where he was born.
of course.
So he has this. Copernicus is a Latinization of his family name. There are, I think, over 50 variant spellings of the family name Kopernik. There are, I think, about 20 variant spellings of the word Copernicus in documents from the time. What is interesting is that there's a big argument amongst the Poles and the Germans as to whether Copernicus is Polish or is German, which is complete rubbish. And there is an official, absolutely official, legal spelling of Copernicus's Polish name, and there's an official legal spelling of Copernicus' German name, and neither of them are in these lists of the known versions of the family name and the name Copernicus. The Germans spell Copernicus with a K, and there is no K spelling of Copernicus at all.
Brilliant.
The version of Copernic that the Poles have doesn't exist in this list of 50 names. Now, it's just one of those bizarre. It's all a political thing. It goes back to the 19th century, 18th. It's all so anyway, this guy Rheticus, he's junior professor for mathematics in Wittenberg, which is the University of Martin Luther, to the time of Martin Luther. He goes off on a sabbatical, which is not unusual. Medieval libraries have books, have manuscripts, which other libraries don't have. So scholars go on wanderings. They go on sabbaticals.
Right.
The books can't come to you, so you go to the books. He goes off on a sabbatical, an official sabbatical. He has a letter of introduction from Philip Melanchthon, who is the professor of natural philosophy in Wittenberg. And he goes to Nuremberg. He goes to Ingolstadt, possibly to Ingolstadt, and he goes to, doesn't really matter. And in Nuremberg, he goes to Nuremberg to visit a guy called Johannes Schöner, who is a mathematician, astronomer, astrologer, to learn astrology. Melanchthon believes in astrology. Melanchthon is a big, big fan of astrology. Luther doesn't. Luther hates astrology. Nobody knows which year Luther was born. And all of the astrologers are trying to find it out. And Luther refuses to tell anybody. This is important for his horoscope, There's a whole historical thing about Luther's date of birth and the astrologers and all the rest of it. Because the Protestant astrologers are all trying to prove that he's God's messenger. And the Catholic astrologers are all trying to prove that he's the devil's messenger. It's sort of... So Rheticus goes off to Nuremberg to visit Johannes Schöner, who is a protege, so to speak, of Philip Melanchthon. They skipped a new system of schools which were set up by Melanchthon, a new system of education. You had the church schools where basically school kids learned Latin and a bit Bible studies and what have you, and then went to university. Melanchthon sets up a school system which is between these, where they get taught real subjects and get a real education before they go to university. This is the equivalent of an English grammar school, although the grammar schools come out of the church schools, and they're called in Germany now. They're called gymnasium, and the very first Melanchthon gymnasium is in Nuremberg, because Nuremberg is the city state, and Nuremberg is the very first Protestant city state in the world.
Gosh.
They set up a Melanchthon school. Johannes Schöner, who is an independent mathematician, globe maker, astronomer, astrologer, gets appointed by Melanchthon as the professor of mathematics at this school in Nuremberg. Rheticus goes to Nuremberg to learn astrology from Schöner, who is regarded as the number one astrologer in Germany at the time, and probably in Nuremberg discovers about Copernicus. And that there's this guy up there in sort of somewhere on the North Sea in the middle of nowhere who's got this really interesting theory. The people in Nuremberg know about Copernicus because Copernicus wrote one of the very few things that Copernicus wrote is called the letter to Werner. Johannes Werner was a Nuremberg mathematician at the beginning of the century, and he had a theory about the number of spheres and all the rest of it. And Copernicus wrote a letter trying to prove that Werner was wrong. And this letter to Werner, which was known in Nuremberg, is one of the very few things that Copernicus ever wrote in his life.
So Copernicus is saying there are no spheres?
Not yet. No. Copernicus believes in the spheres. There's actually a very big debate amongst historians of science, historians of astronomy, whether he did or he didn't. But the general consensus is he did.
Right.
Copernicus's system is still the epicycle deferent model. So Rheticus comes to Nuremberg, discovers about Copernicus, goes home to Austria, and then sets off from Austria to Fromburg to visit Copernicus. This is 1538. Arrives in Fromburg, sort of makes himself known to Copernicus, and sets about trying to convince him to publish De Revolutionibus, his big work on heliocentric astronomy. Copernicus is still not convinced, and Rheticus then writes a small pamphlet which he dedicates to Johannes Schöner. It's an open letter to Johannes Schöner called the Narratio Prima, the first narration, the first telling, which describes the system of Copernicus in non-mathematical terms. Has quite a lot of astrology in it. Leticus is a very much convinced astrologer, and he finds that Copernicus' system is very good for astrology. He gets this published in Danzig. The guy who actually brought him up, because his father got executed when he was a kid, which we won't go into, gets a copy of this and publishes a second edition in Basel, and it's very well received. And because Narratio Prima is well received, he manages to convince Copernicus to let him publish De Revolutionibus. So he then sort of tucks the manuscript under his arm and goes back to Nuremberg, gives the manuscript to Johannes Petraeus. I have a theory that Petraeus actually gave him a commission.
Right.
Petraeus is the leading scientific publisher of the period.
So he sent him off to Copernicus.
They said, well, if you're going up there, if he's got anything interesting, bring it back. I'll publish it. Because he took with him a set of 6 books, 4 of which are publications by Petraeus, scientific publications by Petraeus. And they're sort of like, if you give me your book, I'll do this with it. And they're very beautiful, very good scientific publications. So he comes back to Nuremberg and gives the manuscript to Petraeus and starts editing it for publication. And then Melanchthon says, all right, this is sort of, when are we by now? 42. So he's been away from university now for almost 4 years or something on his sabbatical. Melanchthon says, there's a job for you in Leipzig. You've got to do it. University, go and do it. So he goes off. And a guy called Andreas Osiander, who's a Lutheran preacher, he's the official town preacher of Nuremberg, ends up editing De Revolutionibus for Petraeus. It gets published in 1543. It has people call it a preface, but it's actually ad lectorum, an address to the reader, which is anonymous, but it's written by Andreas Osiander, which says, you don't have to accept this as true. It's a mathematical model.
Mm-hmm.
It makes life easier, but it's not necessarily the truth.
Slightly slippery.
Copernicus dies. There's this wonderful legend that he receives the first copy of his book as he's laying on his deathbed and dies. Yeah. And Tiedemann Giese, who's his best...
I can't believe how they spelled his name. That's what's done him.
No, they spelled it. They spelled it the way that he spells it. Well, the way that we spell it today, Copernicus, is the way that it's spelled on his book. Let's put it like that. So Tiedemann Giese, who's Copernicus's best friend, who's a bishop, writes a very nasty letter to the city council of Nuremberg and says, like, what is this? In the front of his book. And Petraeus gets hauled into the city council, and Petraeus just says, what I put in my books is my business and nobody else's. F off. Yeah? And he's entitled, because this is something that people don't realize. The copyright of books in those days were with the printer publisher and not with the author. If somebody got prosecuted for a book, it was the printer publisher and not the author.
Right.
So Petraeus is perfectly correct. It's his book. He can do what he likes with it. Anyway, the book goes out, and people find it very interesting. Probably this ad lectorum from Osiander helped, because people didn't say, right, he's criticizing the church or whatever.
Yeah.
At the beginning, there's sort of this book is, because Copernicus says this book is written for mathematicians and not for idiots. So it should be read by mathematicians. There weren't actually that many people in the world who could actually read it and understand it. And they read it and they were interested. They were more interested in his mathematical models than they were in his cosmology. The cosmology is being heliocentrismus, yeah? But his mathematical models were new.
Mm-hmm.
They use different mathematical models to Ptolemy. It's still an epicycle deferent model, but he uses things like the Tussi couple. I'm not going to explain that, but it's a thing invented by an Arabic astronomer in which you can basically using circular motion you can get something moving in a straight line. People sort of say, oh, this is interesting. If we do tables based on this, are they going to be more accurate than the so you get what is a instrumental interpretation, which means it doesn't matter if it's the cosmology, if the philosophy is correct. Does it work?
Yeah.
A lot of 20th century physics was done on this basis. We don't try and explain it. We don't try and to explain it in real terms. We just see it. Does it work? Does the mathematical model work?
Yeah.
And so people treated, the majority of people treated Copernicus like this. And people produced planetary tables, produced ephemeridons based on Copernicus. And they weren't any better than the ones based on Ptolemy because it used the same data.
Right.
We still have this problem of the data.
Right.
So we've had Regiomontanus a century earlier saying we need new data, but failing to produce any because he died. So instead, we get new people. The first one is William of Hessen-Kassel, who is a aristocrat of the ruler of a small German state, Hessen-Kassel, who sets up his own observatory, begins to collect new data. A young Danish noble on a study journey, which was unusual. He's a rich Danish aristocrat, comes to visit. William of Hessen-Kassel is a relative of the Danish king, and the young Danish aristocrat is also a relative of the Danish king. He comes there and says, oh, this looks interesting. He was already interested in astronomy and astrology and said, this looks interesting. I could do something like this. Hessen-Kassel writes to the Danish king and says, look, you got this young guy, give him an observatory. So the Danish king does, and that young guy is a guy called Tycho Brahe. Denmark is ruled by an oligarchy of 20 aristocratic families. Tycho Brahe's father and mother are both prominent members of two of the leading families. So he's one of the most prominent aristocrats, and it's very unusual for an aristocrat to become a scholar. But one of Tycho Brahe's uncles is the Chancellor of Denmark. He's the most important politician in the whole of Denmark. He basically rules the country. He is also a scholar, and he supports his nephew. The king grants the island of Havane to Tycho Brahe as his fief. And people say, wow, amazing. Actually, according to his ancestry and to his relatives, he should have got a much, much bigger and much more expensive fief. The king was getting away with a cheap deal.
He swindled.
No, because people, wow, the king financed this amazing observatory. Why did he do it? In fact, he got a good deal, because if Tycho had insisted on getting what he was entitled to, and another of his uncles, who brought him up, was the Lord Admiral of Denmark. I mean, this guy is at the top of the tree.
He's connected.
He's got connections. He gets this island and the money to finance it, and builds this incredible observatory and a alchemical laboratory and all sorts of stuff, and his own printing works, and it is the most modern scientific center in the whole of Europe. Bang. Designs and builds the most modern astronomical observational instruments that the world has seen, and sets out in this amazing program to collect astronomical data. And at this point, all that interests him is trying to get a new set of data. He's not interested in models at this point. His motivation, he was already an amateur astronomer, and there was a solar eclipse which he wanted to observe, which he did observe before all of this. The Ptolemaic table said it would take place then, and the Copernican table said it would take place then, and it didn't take place on either of the occasions. And so he thought, right, we got to get rid of this. We got to get back to basics. We need new data. So you got two people, Hessen-Kassel and Tycho Brahe on Havane, collecting data, and they're exchanging information. They are connected to each other. Mm-hmm. Both of them he has an incredible team of people working there. Tycho, he's not alone. He's got this amazing setup. It really is a scientific research center. He spends 20 years collecting data on the most sophisticated basis. And he's got some really, really good people working for him. And people come and work for him for a couple of years and go away and set themselves up somewhere else. Lots of people come there and work, and some of them stay for a long time and some stay for short times and all the rest of it.
So he's known as the big research center. Yeah,
it's well known. I mean, he's well connected. He communicates with other people, as does Hessen, because they all do. There's this thing that people forget. These people communicated with each other. They're exchanging data. They're exchanging information. They're exchanging. Now, like, so there are scientific discussions going on between these various centers. They're not alone.
Right.
They do their thing. Everybody communicates with everybody else. So, like, Tycho does his thing for about 20 years. The king dies, and the new king, his son, doesn't like Tycho. Tycho is an arrogant arsehole. I mean, excuse me, but he's very arrogant. He's very, They have an argument, and Tycho says, "Right, I'm going." Packs everything together and sets off. He leaves Denmark. But before that all happens, a guy called Paul Wittig, who's a sort of Polish German, he's somewhere in this sort of northern German, southern Poland area, mathematician who's an itinerant. He turns up all sorts of places. He turns up in Nuremberg. He turns up in Hessen Castle, and he turns up in Havane. And he's been looking at Copernicus, and he's been looking at Ptolemy. He's well aware of Capella, and he says, "What would happen if we put all of the planets around the sun?" And the sun revolves around the sun and the moon revolve around the Earth. And he plays with various variations on this model. And it's almost certainly from him that Tycho gets the idea of what becomes known as the Tychonic model, in which the planets orbit the sun and the moon orbit the Earth.
Right.
This is the correct term for it is a heliogeocentric system.
Which to us, it sounds daft because it seems like it's too involved. But why not? Something's got to be right.
The thing is, it works.
Right.
It works mathematically. And what's interesting is not only does Wittig come up with this, but various other people simultaneously come up with it. They're looking at ways of preserving the advantages of Copernicus within a geocentric system, because the big problem is there is no evidence, there is no proof that the Earth moves.
Right.
Nothing. If the Earth orbits the sun, then you should be able to detect stellar parallax.
And what is stellar?
Which means that if you look at a single star against the background of the heavens, you choose one star and you look at it.
Right.
From one side of the Earth's orbit, and then from the other side of the Earth's orbit, then its position against the background should change. It's the old thing you learn it in school. Everybody gets at school the explanation of parallax. If you put your finger in front of your nose and close one of your eyes, and then close the other one and open it, the finger moves.
Right.
Because you're viewing it from one angle and then viewing it from the other angle. It moves against the background. It doesn't move. It appears to move. And if the Earth is going around its orbit, and you look at the star from one end of the orbit, and you look at the star from the other end of the orbit, then the star should move against the background. They don't. At least they don't appear to.
Right. In order not to appear to, they would have to be a very... Sorry, go on.
Copernicus' explanation, which is the correct one, is that the stars are so far away that the angles are so small that you can't detect it. But this would make the cosmos as it existed then, which is just our solar system. In fact, it's only the solar system bit to Saturn. The distance from the Earth to Saturn was basically known to Copernicus. It would make the distance from Saturn to the fixed stars unbelievable.
Right.
Yeah. And people couldn't swallow this. And within a Tychonic system, you don't have this problem.
Right.
The Tychonic solar system, the Tychonic cosmos is much smaller. Yeah.
Yeah.
There are other arguments as well. If it really is, the stars appear to have a certain size. And if they really were as far away as Copernicus says they are, then again, they would be unbelievably big. One star would be bigger than the orbit of Saturn around the sun, which some of them are.
Yes,
but again, at the time, it just appeared ridiculous.
Oh, yeah.
And this is the big star argument. My friend Chris Graney has written a really beautiful book about all of these arguments. It's like just really sort of problematic. So we get this hybrid system, the Tychonic system. And what is interesting, we get two versions of the hybrid system. We get one with a static Earth and one with diurnal rotation.
Right.
And they're champions of both systems. And it's rather interesting that people are prepared to accept diurnal rotation within a geocentric system much earlier than they're prepared to accept that the Earth goes around the sun. And this is really the case that they do. And it's basically the physical argument. It's the Earth that rotates and not the stars. Yeah?
Which again is this sort of more parsimonious argument, right?
Basically, a form of Occam's razor. So we're going up towards 1600. Copernicus is dead. Tycho's system has been proposed by Tycho and lots of other people. Wittek never published it. We only discovered Wittek had 2 copies of De Revolutionibus, and in the flyleaf of the 2 copies, his calculations of this system. And what's interesting is Tycho knew this, and Tycho spent an incredible amount of time trying to acquire these copies so that nobody would discover that this system was. Tycho, it's my system, no, not Wittek's. It's really fascinating that the sort of
the egos.
So Tycho basically leaves Denmark and wanders around a bit. He visits Hessen Castle and then goes off to Prague. And Tycho is, of course, he's a Lutheran because he's from Denmark. The Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II appoints him Imperial Mathematicus. Rudolf is an interesting figure. He's very, very much interested in the sciences. He's very much interested in the occult sciences. So he's interested in alchemy. He's interested in astrology. He's interested in all sorts of stuff. And he collects scholars. And he sort of gives Tycho a castle and get money. Although with Rudolf, money is always a big problem because he's basically bankrupt. So he never pays his bills. So like Tycho sets up in outside of Prague and starts recruiting again because he's lost most of his people because they don't travel with him.
Right.
And his most important assistant astronomer, Longomontanus, comes back and starts working for him in Prague. Another guy turns up or applies who would go on to write history, as they say. This guy is called Johannes Kepler. Kepler was born in Weil der Stadt, which is a small town in southern Germany. He basically was in a very poor family, but he was obviously very bright. At the time, there were state scholarships in Württemberg because it was a Protestant state, and all of the pastors and church school teachers had been Catholic. So they needed large numbers of pastors and school teachers. So they had scholarship schemes to educate young men to become a new generation of school teachers, pastors, and all the rest of it. Kepler managed to get one of these scholarships. He ended up at the University of Tübingen under, amongst others, a guy called Michael Mesklin. And Michael Mesklin is interesting because he's one of the first people who actually believed in heliocentric system. He's a Copernican.
The real deal.
He's one of the there are very, very few Copernicans at this time. This is sort of late 16th century. Michael Mesklin is a Copernican, and he's teaching. He teaches Ptolemaic. He's a professor of mathematics. He teaches Ptolemaic astronomy because that's what he's supposed to teach. But he also teaches Copernican astronomy. There's a sort of myth that he did this secretly. He didn't. He did it quite openly. Kepler accepts it. Kepler believes it. Kepler becomes a convinced Copernican. And he acquires a second-hand copy of De Revolutionibus, which I've actually seen. It's probably worth about $10 million these days. It's in the University of Leipzig in their library, but it was in an exhibition in Nuremberg. I went and saw it. So, like, Kepler's in this scheme, and there's this story that Kepler was studying theology. He never did. He was in this scheme to train pastors and school teachers. Kepler was very religious. He wanted to become a pastor. But on the recommendation of Mesklin, he got off a job as a school teacher in Austria, and he could have rejected it. But if he turned down the job he got offered, he would have to pay back his scholarship. That was a scholarship deal. The people in the scholarship scheme got appointed to jobs.
Yeah.
If they refused to accept the job, they then had to pay back their scholarship, and Kepler couldn't. So he went off rather bad-tempered. He went off to Austria and became a school teacher. Became a Protestant school teacher in a very Catholic area, which meant basically he had almost no pupils. He's teaching astronomy. He's teaching astronomy and astrology. He's the maths teacher. He's also the district mathematician, which means he's responsible for things like cartography and also astrology. He has to produce a astrological journal once a year. And his first one is very accurate. It's very good. So he gets a very good reputation. He comes up with this. He got this question which seems to us ridiculous. He's a Copernican, so for him there are 5 planets. No, 6 planets. 6 planets. Mercury, Venus, Mars. No,
you got the moon.
There are 5. No, the moon 6. No, because the moon goes on the Earth. The Earth is 1, because the Earth is now a planet, the Copernican. So there are 6. His argument is, why are there 6 planets, and why do they have the distances between them they have? One day he's explaining something. He's explaining the cycles of Jupiter and Saturn, because they have regular cycles in a heliocentric system around the sun. The conjunctions of the two of them produce a geometrical pattern over so many years, because they meet. Conjunction means that they meet in the heavens. They appear to be in the same place. And he comes up with this, there must be a geometrical model. God is a geometer, and there must be a geometrical model which he has designed the planets on. And he tries various two-dimensional models, and none of them work. He then thinks of sort of three-dimensional and says, well, there are 5 platonic solids. And the platonic solids are the only regular solids which, if you take triangles, squares, and so forth, which are regular solids, you can only make 5, because above that doesn't work. You have irregular and semi-regular and all the rest. There are only 5 platonic solids. And he works out this model with the platonic solids filling the spaces between the planets. And it fits.
Gosh, it would.
It fits. Not really good, but it fits. And this becomes and he writes a book about this, Mysterium Cosmographicum, which he publishes with the help of Mikko Messlin, and says this is a proof of the Copernican system. Mikko Messlin is, of course, Copernican, and this appears in 1596. And about this time, the Catholic authorities in Austria sort of say, well, no, we don't want any Protestants, get out. The first time they say this to Kepler, because he's such a successful astrologer, he gets an exception, and he's allowed to stay. But the second time, it gets really, really dodgy, and he starts looking for work. And he wants to go back to Tübingen, and he asks Messlin for support. And for some reason, Messlin refuses to support him, refuses to let him come back to Tübingen, and refuses to find him a job. And it's one of the great mysteries. But anyway, he's sort of looking at, and he sends copies of this to establish himself. He sends copies of this book to various astronomers around Europe. And he sends one to a guy whose name is Ursus, who also has a Tychonic system with diurnal rotation, who Tycho has accused of plagiarism.
Oh, great.
And Ursus was the imperial mathematicus in Prague before Tycho, and fled when Tycho came to Prague, because he realized Tycho was going to do nasty things to him. And he sent one to Tycho. He sort of wrote an incredible sort of, because at the time Ursus was imperial mathematicus, he wrote an incredible sort of dedication to Ursus in his copy, and Tycho was really pissed off about this, and wrote to Messlin. He knew Messlin, and sort of said, like, what's going on here? Tell this young puppy dog to behave himself. And then, of course, when Kepler had to leave, this is end of the 16th century, when Kepler had to leave Austria, he applied for a job in Prague with Tycho.
Oh, gosh.
So, he goes off to Prague, and Tycho is prepared to forgive him, because he realizes that Kepler is a really, really good mathematician, and he realizes this. He wants to employ him. So he lets him sort of creep a bit. And then there's a blazing row between the two of them.
Oh, God.
And then somebody else negotiates. Kepler sitting in a hotel being bolshy. Tycho sitting in his castle being bolshy. And somebody negotiates, and Tycho gives him a job. So he then goes back to Prague, gets his wife and family and his household, and goes back to Graz. Gets his wife and family and heads back to Prague, and becomes Tycho's assistant. And what Tycho does is, rather than pay Kepler himself, he gets him appointed to produce the tables based on his data.
Right.
And he gets Rudolf to employ Kepler directly to produce what became the Rudolphine tables. And Kepler had lots of problems because Rudolf didn't pay. He was always, he'd been hardly settled in Prague. Tycho dies.
Just as well he was employed by Rudolf if Rudolf would only have paid him.
Well, no. Rudolf then appoints Kepler as Imperial Mathematicus. But Kepler has a big problem because the data doesn't belong to Rudolf. The data belongs to Tycho, and Tycho has heirs, his daughter and her husband. Kepler is actually sitting on the data. He's got it, but it doesn't belong to him. So there are year-long negotiations between Tycho's son-in-law and Kepler. And in the end, what they arrange is that if Kepler publishes anything, then the son-in-law is co-author.
Right.
Because it's his data. Kepler then, he got set the task by Tycho of determining the orbit of Mars. And he spends several years trying to determine the orbit of Mars. On his deathbed, Tycho had said that Kepler had to prove the Tychonic system. And Kepler said, okay, we'll do it. Because he doesn't. So Kepler battles with the orbit of Mars. And he calls it a battle. He calls it a war. And finally, because he's still trying to produce a circular orbit.
Right.
And he does produce a circular orbit, which is very accurate. It's more accurate than any orbit of any planet that has been produced before. But he says it isn't accurate enough to justify Tycho's data, because Tycho's data is on a level of accuracy that is, for the time, unbelievable. So he goes back to the drawing board and eventually comes up with his planetary laws, or the first two of them. And one of the first things he does is one of the things that Copernicus did was to take out the equant point out of Ptolemaic astronomy. And this is the point where you measure the speed of the orbit. Kepler puts it back in. And these 2 points on both sides of the Earth are effectively the focal points of an ellipse.
Right.
And what Kepler's two laws say is that the planets go around the sun, not around the Earth. But the orbits are elliptical, and the sun is at one of the focal points of the ellipse. If you draw an ellipse, if you draw a circle, you need 1 point in the middle to draw it. If you draw an ellipse, you need 2 points. And you put a piece of string around the 2 points and put a pencil in the piece of string. You make a loop, and you go around it, and that produces your ellipse. And depending on how far apart the 2 points are and how long the piece of string is, you get different ellipses. So Kepler says a planetary orbit is an ellipse with the sun at one of the focal points. It's one of these 2 points where you draw the ellipse in. That's his first law, which he actually was the second one he discovered. And the second law says that if you draw a line from the sun to the orbit, this line covers equal areas in equal periods of time. And of course, because it's not the center of the ellipse, it's offset, these areas are different, which means that the traveler's speed around the ellipse is different, which was well known. I mean, the already Hipparchus knew that the planetary orbits are not uniform.
I love the idea that Hipparchus living, I don't know, what is it, sort of 500, 1,000, 400 BC, he's getting that the speed is different. I find that astonishing.
Because the period between you have the winter solstice, summer solstice, spring and autumn equinoxes, and the periods between them differ. They're not equal.
Right. So it's big enough for him to measure.
So it's not, they're not traveling at the same speed, and they don't. The further away the planet is from the sun, the slower it travels. The closer it is, the faster it travels. Yeah? It's as a result of gravity. He produces his two first planetary laws, which he publishes in 1609 in his first major publication. Meanwhile, he sent a copy of his Mysterium Cosmographicum to Galileo, which he didn't. This is a sort of rather strange story. Galileo has turned up. Galileo has been born. He's a son of a minor aristocrat who is basically broke, who is a musician. Galileo originally goes to university to study medicine, doesn't like it, leaves university, privately studies mathematics, proves to be a very good mathematician, gets a couple of important sponsors who get him the chair of mathematics at the University of Padua. He doesn't have a degree or anything like this. It's who you know, not what you know. In Pisa. Sorry, not Padua comes later. In Pisa, becomes professor of mathematics in Pisa, then moves to Padua, becomes professor of mathematics in Padua. Kepler sends a friend of Kepler's goes to Italy, and he gives him 2 copies of the Mysterium Cosmographicum. says if he finds anybody interesting on his routes, to give them a copy. People did this. They distributed their books. It's how you get a reputation. So he sends this off. On the way back, the guy stops off in Pisa, or was it already Padua? I'm not quite sure. I can't remember. And sort of says, is there a professor of mathematics here? And he gets introduced to Galileo, and he says, I got this book. I got 2 copies of this book that might interest you. He doesn't know who Galileo is. Galileo doesn't know who he is. Kepler doesn't know who Galileo is. Galileo doesn't know who Kepler is. It's about Copernican astronomy. You can read it if you like. And goes back home. Yeah. So Galileo writes a letter to Kepler and says, "Oh, you're a Copernican. I'm a Copernican too, but I don't talk about it." And Kepler says he gets this letter from this rather strange guy in Italy whose first name is the same as his last name. Because he's Galileo, and that's in Latin is Galileos. Yeah. So this is they don't know each other.
Right. They completely don't know each other.
They completely don't know each other. So that's their first contact, and Kepler writes back and says, "Oh, you got to propagate Copernicus. You got to become a real fan." And Galileo doesn't answer. That's the end of it. That's the end of the first correspondence. This is sort of
that's the end of that.
So Galileo basically does all this stuff on laws of fall, but doesn't publish it. Becomes the maths tutor of the then young heir of the de' Medici in Florence. So he's well in with the Medicis. In 1608, Hans Lippershey, a German optician living in Holland, in Middelburg in Holland, invents the telescope. This gets out and it becomes very famous. Within a year, there are telescopes all over Europe, and various people are pointing the telescopes at the heavens, including Thomas Harriot and Henry Lower in England, Simon Marius just down the road from Nuremberg, a couple of guys in Denmark, and so forth, and Galileo in Padua. They're all making various discoveries with this new astronomical instrument. Galileo is trundling along, and he sort of realizes that the moon is like the Earth, has mountains and all the rest of it, which isn't anything new because there are various Greek philosophers who thought this anyway. So it's not that sensational, although according to Aristotle, the moon, all of the heavenly bodies are smooth spheres.
Right.
So this again is a problem for Aristotle's cosmology. There have been other problems for Aristotle's cosmology, like sort of Aristotle said because the heavens are perfect, comets must be sublunar. By 1610, everybody knew that comets are supralunar based on observations. And this is something, it goes all the way back to Regiomontanus and Feuerbach start this whole thing with the comets. Or actually earlier than them, Toscanelli is the first person who tries to track comets as astronomical objects at the beginning of the 15th century. So there are a whole lot of things. By now, the spheres have disappeared because of comets and because of also the perfection of the heavens. The people have observed supernova and so forth. So the perfection of heavens was shot. So a lot of Aristotle's cosmology was in the dustbin anyway. So the moon is no longer smooth. He's discovered a whole lot of new stars. He's discovered some of the nebula, which are just, nebula means cloud, are actually distant stars, groups of distant stars. So this is his initial discoveries. And then he discovers the moons of Jupiter, the first 4 moons of Jupiter. Jupiter now has 63, I think, moons. But the 4 biggest moons he discovers. And Simon Marius in Nuremberg discovers them a day later, which is one of the most beautiful things in the history of astronomy. Galileo, when he discovers the moons of Jupiter, realizes he's hit the jackpot. In his notes are in Tuscan. He's writing in Tuscan. And the day he discovers the first moons of Jupiter, he discovers the first 3 of them. He immediately changes to Latin because he knows he's going to publish this. So he tracks the moons of Jupiter, determines that they are really moons. They are satellites of Jupiter, planets, and not stars. Then he writes his Sidereus Nuncius, the starry messenger, however you translate it, and publishes it, like 1609. Instantly becomes the most famous astronomer in Europe, overnight.
And what is the significance of what he's found?
They are bodies which are orbiting a planet and not orbiting the sun, and not orbiting the Earth. Yeah?
Yeah.
They are orbiting a planet, which explains, because one of the things in the Copernican theory is that the moon orbits the Earth and everything else orbits the sun, including the Earth. So why? And now we have moons orbiting Jupiter. Oh, looks interesting. It doesn't prove anything. It disproves the homocentric theory because they are very definitely orbiting Jupiter and not orbiting the Earth or the Sun. So we do not have a single center of motion.
Right. Aristotle's system's already gone.
Aristotle's yeah. So people have a lot of problems confirming these observations. Telescopes at this time are totally crap. They are useless. The lenses are very bad. The glass is very bad. They are very primitive. It's very difficult to confirm what Galileo has published. The astronomers of the Collegio Romano, which is the Jesuit university in Rome, have been using telescopes to make observations before Galileo published. They had their own telescopes.
Right.
They set about trying to prove or disprove all of the observations that Galileo published with Galileo's support. They cooperate. The thing that the church and Galileo, rubbish. Yeah? They actually managed to, it takes them about a year, but they finally managed to confirm all of Galileo's observations, including the moons of Jupiter. They throw a big banquet for Galileo in Rome and praise him to the heavens. Yeah, and this is the hardcore. This is the Jesuits.
Yes.
Yeah. So the hardcore Catholic missionaries who are leading the Counter-Reformation. Yeah. So Galileo is big time. Yeah. He's very much, he's a superstar.
Yeah, he's hit the jackpot, right?
Right from the very beginning. Kepler is half blind. Kepler has a visual defect. He can't confirm anything, but he immediately supports Galileo. As soon as he gets a copy of the Sidereus Nuncius, he writes a book, a reply to the Sidereus Nuncius, and sends a copy to Galileo, who pirates it and publishes it in Italy without permission and without Kepler's knowledge, because the Imperial Mathematicus is supporting him. Because Kepler is a very important figure at this point. He's the most important mathematician astronomer in Europe. So Galileo getting his support is very important. Galileo wants to be the man that proves the Copernican system. There is still no proof. There's absolutely no proof. The next thing that happens is various people, Marius, Harriot, the Jesuits, and Galileo all observe. Who did it first is difficult, but it probably wasn't Galileo. The phases of Venus. Both systems, in the geocentric system and in the heliocentric system, Venus should have phases, but the phases it has are different. Phases like the phases of the moon, yeah? But the phases it has are different. And the phases it have confirm that Venus orbits the sun and not the Earth. And as I say, Galileo, the Jesuits, Simon Marius, Harriot all make this observation. That means a pure geocentric system from Ptolemy is dead. By analogy, people assume that Mercury also orbits the sun. We are back to the Capellan system.
Right.
The arguments for Mercury and Venus orbiting the sun are old. We now have proof that Venus orbits the sun. The phases of Mercury are first observed in 1633, I think, 1634. So it's much later. But so we're now 1613. The pure geocentric system is dead. The Copernican system cannot be proved. You can't prove that the Earth moves. The default system becomes a taconic system. With or without diurnal rotation, you have both models. There are still people arguing for a homocentric Aristotelian system. There are still people arguing for a Capellan system with only Mercury and Venus orbiting the sun. We have people arguing for Copernicus. We have people arguing for Tycho with diurnal rotation, Tycho without diurnal rotation. And we have people arguing for a Keplerian system. And Kepler's system is not regarded as being the same as Copernicus' system because he rejects circular orbits. So we've got all of these systems competing with each other around 1613. By about 1620, maybe a bit later, there are only really two candidates still around. And that's the Taconic system with diurnal rotation, because Longomontanus, who is the biggest representative of Taconic astronomy, has done a new one based on Tycho's data and has published it, and it is one with diurnal rotation. So we have a Taconic system with diurnal rotation based on Tycho's data, because up until now nobody had done it. Because Kepler didn't. Kepler did a Copernican system or did a heliocentric system. And we have Kepler's elliptical system, mainly as a result of his third law, which he discovers in 1618, which relates the distance of the planets from the sun to the speed of speed of their orbits. Mathematically, you learn Kepler's third law in school these days. It's still valid. Mm. In fact, Kepler's third law is mathematically equivalent to the law of gravity. They're the same thing.
Interesting.
Yeah?
You can derive one from the other.
You can derive one. It's exactly what Newton does. This is exactly what Newton does. He starts with the one and derives the other, and starts with the other and derives the one and proves that they're equivalent. And because Kepler's third law is empirical,
right,
he has proved the law of gravity. Yeah, this comes much later. But anyway, so about 1620, you only have two systems that are seriously in consideration, which is a Tychonic system with diurnal rotation and a Keplerian system with elliptical orbits. Fine. Earlier than this, 1616, Galileo runs into trouble with the church. 1615. Not because of astronomy in itself or cosmology in itself, but because he tells the church how to interpret the Bible.
Right.
One of Galileo's students had been having dinner with Grand Duchess Christina of the Medici family, and she asked him, well, what is the problem between a heliocentric system and the Bible? They contradict each other. And Castelli, the student, sort of says, well, writes a letter to Galileo and says, help. Galileo writes a letter to Castelli in which he interprets the Bible.
Right, so he's treading on toes.
He's more than treading on toes, and people ignore this completely. The big thing about the Reformation, up until the Reformation, the Catholic Church has the thing that we are the only people who are allowed to interpret the Bible. And the people who interpret the Bible are the church fathers. Luther comes along and says, no, anybody can interpret the Bible. Everybody can interpret it for themselves. And this is what the Reformation is. That's the whole point.
Yeah.
Later, Luther changes his mind because people start interpreting the Bible in ways that he doesn't agree with. You know, like, so he starts calling them wrong. You know, it's sort of,
obviously.
That's irrelevant. Yeah. In the 1570s, the church holds its Council of Trient and says, no, stop. Redefines church law and says only the church is allowed to interpret the Bible, and launches the Counter-Reformation. The Jesuits become the leading force of the Counter-Reformation. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So the fact that Jesuits support Galileo and support his work, you know, is pretty important. Along comes this Mathematicus, and within the academic hierarchy, and there is a hierarchy, there's a very strict hierarchy, theologians are at the top, and a Mathematicus is at the very, 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 very bottom, about on the level of the cleaning lady. So you've got a Mathematicus, doesn't matter about his superstar status, you've got a Mathematicus telling the theologians how to interpret the Bible. That is a big no-no. And at the same time, there's another guy down in southern Italy, whose name escapes me at the moment, Foscarini, doing exactly the same thing. And Foscarini he's a monk, and he gets slapped on the wrist for this, and he thinks it's unfair. And he sends his pamphlet in which he does this to Roberto Bellarmino, who is the leading church theologian. He's number one. And he's the most respected theologian in Europe, and a very intelligent and very, very, very educated man. And he knows his astronomy, and he used to teach astronomy at university. He's not an idiot. He says to Bellarmino, am I wrong to do this? Foscarini. And Bellarmino writes a very famous letter, which is called the Foscarini letter, addressed to Foscarini, but he also addresses Galileo at the same time, and says, you do well to treat the heliocentric hypothesis as a hypothesis, to speak of it hypothetically, but do not speak of it as fact, because it contradicts the Bible. And there exists no proof for it. If somebody produces proof for the heliocentric system, then we will have to reinterpret the Bible. But until they do, please only talk about the system hypothetically. Galileo gets called in. At the same time, the whole thing has been referred to a committee of examiners who come to the judgment that the heliocentric system is heretical in terms of the Bible and absurd in philosophy.
And by philosophy, they mean science, do they?
Science, yeah. And by absurd, they mean it's not proven, which is the correct status. Yeah. Heliocentricity is never declared heretical. That's another mistake. It's another myth, because only the Pope can declare something heretical. and nobody does. No pope ever does. And what the ruling is that you can talk about heliocentricity hypothetically, but not as a proven theory.
Which it isn't.
This is the church's ruling. Bellarmine, who is not part of this committee, gets instructed by the Pope to tell this to Galileo. He calls Galileo in. They have a nice chat. They have a very friendly chat. And at the end of it, Galileo is instructed not to hold or teach the heliocentric theory. Yeah?
Yeah.
That is as a fact. Galileo goes away. So everybody says Galileo has been censored by the church. Galileo hasn't been censored by the church. He complains to Bellarmino. Bellarmino says, okay, I'll give you a letter. This man has not been censored by the church. He's our friend. Nothing has happened. Blah, blah, blah. This is 1616. So one of Galileo's supporters, one of Galileo's friends, is a guy called Bellarmino. No, names. Doesn't matter. He's a very important cardinal. He becomes friend of Galileo. He says in sort of 1613, slow down a bit. The church is very slow at changing its opinions. Don't provoke. You'd be like sort of poking a bear with a stick. Don't do it. Barberini. So in 1618, Galileo gets involved in a big argument with the Jesuits about comets. And the Jesuits say that comets are like everybody else, says that comets are supralunar. Galileo gets asked his opinion on this, and the problem is that in 1618, Galileo had been ill and hadn't observed the comets. There'd been 3 comets, and one of them was a major comet. And Galileo says, no, they're not supralunar, they're sublunar, there's complete rubbish, which is, of course, Aristotle's opinion. And people say, why does he do this? And the simple reason is because Tycho had said comets are supralunar and they orbit the sun. So if they do orbit the sun, and the evidence in 1618 is that they do orbit the sun, it's a proof for the Tychonic system.
Right.
And Galileo doesn't want to accept the Tychonic system. So he rejects this. He rejects the science. He rejects the observations and says, no, it's rubbish. And it develops this big argument. And it's a pamphlet war with a Jesuit named Orazio Grazzi. In the end, it ends famously with Galileo's Essay, Il Saggiatore, which is a brilliant piece of polemic, but a bloody awful piece of science. When Galileo comes out with his, there are 2 books, the Book of Nature and the Bible. And the Book of Nature is written in the language of geometry, mathematics. And everybody says, wow, Galileo is brilliant. He's the first person to say so. If you go back to the 12th century and Robert Grosseteste's, you can find almost the same quote. There's nothing new. People like Simon Stephan, Kepler, Benedetti earlier, Tagliatelle, have all been doing mathematical science long before Galileo was born. You know, like it's sort of this claim that Galileo is the first person to do mathematical science is the biggest, one of the biggest myths in, and it keeps getting propagated. People keep quoting this.
It's particularly funny that it appears in the context of something that was actually dead wrong.
Yeah, and Mario Baggioli, a very good historian, actually points this out. You know, like everybody ignores the fact that Galileo is arguing for the wrong thing. Galileo is a brilliant polemical author. His greatest talent is a polemicist. And at the time that Il Saggiatore is published, Barberini becomes Pope, Urban VIII. And he gets given a copy of Il Saggiatore, and he loves it. And he's a big friend of Galileo's anyway. So he starts granting Galileo audiences. I'd like to get an audience with the Pope. It's like, and this guy is just a mathematicus, you know, like sort of. Galileo says to Barberini, he sort of says, well, you know, like sort of, the Protestants are laughing at us. And Barberini says, why? And he says, well, you know, like sort of because we won't have anything to do with heliocentricity. And they do. You know, like Kepler is a Protestant, of course, yeah. He persuades Barberini to let him write a book in which he presents the 2 world systems. And it's supposed to be a balanced presentation.
Right.
Geocentricity on one side, heliocentricity on the other side, and blah, blah, blah. Galileo sits down and starts writing this book. And this is his famous Dialogo. Of course, he doesn't write a balanced account. It's totally biased. Anybody reading it has no doubts whatsoever that he is 100% propagating a heliocentric system, which is forbidden from doing. You know?
And particularly as he's been invited to do this by the Pope, it's really kicking him in the shins pretty hard.
Yeah. And the book gets published in 1632. Everybody goes, wow. And it gets given to 3 people to read and adjudicate, and all of them say, well, yeah, he's teaching and holding and teaching heliocentric theory. There's no doubt about this. And you read it, there's no doubt about it whatsoever. The Pope, in the meantime, is under an incredible amount of pressure. Politically, there is a struggle going on between France and Spain to control the papacy, to control the church. The Medicis are viewed as being on the wrong side, and Galileo is a servant of the Medicis. A Catholic astrologer has forecast the death of the Pope, who happens to be a very close friend and colleague of Galileo. And Galileo had dinner with him the day before the astrologer is arrested for doing this. So Galileo is not in good favor. I mean, like these sort of the political aspects, the astrological aspects, all get ignored. People say, the church is anti-science. It has very little to do with science. He has broken a church injunction. And that is what he gets accused of. And he gets summoned to Rome. Doesn't come initially. Comes up with all sorts of excuses. He's an old man, he's ill, they're not really excuses, but eventually gets no choice. If he doesn't come, he'll get put in irons and dragged to Rome, so he goes to Rome. The Medici don't support him. The Medici don't want to know. They rather disapprove of the fact that he's going to stay at the Medici embassy in Rome. They don't want him. He's an embarrassment. He gets taken to the Inquisition. He actually gets... In the palace of the Inquisition, he gets his own apartment with servants, cooks, all the rest of it. He gets treated as an honoured guest. So all of the things about Galileo being thrown into prison, chains, and all rubbish. The first day he gets examined, and he says, "Well, I might have overstepped the mark. I didn't mean to. It was unintentional. If you let me rewrite the book, I'll put it right." It's complete bullshit. The book is out there. It's written. It's out there. And the other thing is he produces this letter from Bellarmino, thinking it's a get out of free jail card. And at the time, there is a protocol from this meeting which says he was instructed that people have tried to argue that this protocol is a fake. It isn't. Yeah.
Sorry, this protocol?
When he produces his letter from Bellarmino, and this protocol from 1616, which says that he was instructed not to teach or hold, gets laid on the table and says, well, how do you explain this, Signor Galileo? And as I say, people have argued that this thing is a fake. The church faked it they didn't. Then the Inquisitor goes for a walk with him in the garden and says, look, if you admit you're wrong, plead guilty, we let you off lightly. And you've got no hope of proving you're not guilty. So they go back for the second session, the second day, and Galileo says, okay. He gets found guilty, gets sentenced to life imprisonment on a charge of suspicion of vehement suspicion of heresy, which is actually a lesser charge.
What does it actually mean, vehement suspicion of heresy?
It means you might have committed a crime. Basically,
Yeah, you're a wrong un.
Gets sentenced to life imprisonment, which is commuted within 24 hours by the Pope to house arrest.
And by house arrest, what do we mean by house arrest? He's in his house and he has gardens and...
We'll get there in a minute.
Okay.
Has to go through the formal thing of abjuring, putting on the white vest of a sinner, going for the court, abjuring, and all the rest. And then he goes off. The first 6 months, he is the guest of an archbishop in a palace, at which point the Pope intervenes and says, well, that's not quite what we meant. He then goes home to his own luxury villa in Toscana with servants and all the rest of it. He spends his rest of his life there, writing his Discorsi, which is actually the book he should be acknowledged for, not the Dialogo. The point about the Dialogo is he maintains in the Dialogo, he maintains his belief that comets are sublunar and actually argues for that, which is complete rubbish because all other astronomers say no, that they're superlunar and we can prove it. He comes up with his theory of the tides, which he actually first produced in 1615 and might actually be from Paolo Zappi, his friend in Padua, and not from Galileo himself. He's very fond of pinching things from other people. And his theory of tides, it's an interesting thing, but it's scientifically complete rubbish. What he says is, if the Earth is moving, if you think of the Earth as being a bowl of water, if you move a bowl of water, the water slops around.
Yeah.
The tides are the water slopping around on the Earth because the Earth is moving. The only problem is his theory mathematically says there is only one tide a day, and it's always at the same time. Now, anybody who lives on the coast, I grew up on the coast, can tell you there are two tides on the day, two tides every day, and the times they change, they travel according to the lunar cycle. And people had noticed this already in ancient Greece. And the theory that the tides are caused by the moon was already known in antiquity. And it's one that Kepler accepted. And Galileo actually attacks Kepler for this.
Extraordinary.
And you can actually understand him because it's occult. It's magic. It's not science. It is science. Newton proved it was science. But at that point, the proof that the moon causes the tides was there is correlation, but there is no causation, so to speak. There's no actual proof.
But it seems a little bit odd as well. You would think that Galileo's theory of relativity would speak against this idea that this moving bowl of water, it would slop around.
Yeah, which actually Galileo's theory of relativity was already propagated by Euclid in ancient Greece. I mean, there's nothing new about it. It's again, you can't. Galileo's theory of relativity says you can't tell whether, if you're in the hold of a ship, you can't tell whether the ship is moving or not moving, and all the rest of it. The big point about Dialogo is the two world systems that he presents: Ptolemaic geocentrism and Copernican heliocentricity.
He's missed one out.
Well, he's missed two out, because he misses Tycho and he misses Kepler, which is actually the two accepted systems at the time. Both the Copernican system and the Ptolemaic system have been abandoned by astronomers anyway. So he's putting up a fake argument about two systems which are no longer accepted. So the whole thing is rather strange.
So I mean, that's outrageous. I mean, that's a straw manning to the nth degree.
Yeah, it really is straw manning. And because people argue the church is fundamentally anti-science, and Galileo is the great scientist, they ignore these facts. They simply ignore them. The same with Il Saggiatore, as you say it. They ignore the fact that he's wrong about comets. You know, Galileo can't be wrong.
It's like he's scripture, right? He's holy scripture, and holy scripture or holy Galileo can't be wrong. It's infallible.
What's interesting about it is that people ignore the Discorsi, and the Discorsi is about his physics, about the laws of fall and all the rest of it, and even that is based on a lot of stuff that goes back more than 1,000 years. There's a whole development of this. It's not original to Galileo, but he produces an experimental mathematical proof of the laws of fall and motion and all the rest of it. And this is the basis on which the new physics is built in the 17th century, which is necessary to prove that the envelope that Copernicus suggested actually travels around with the Earth. And this is the beginnings of the theory of gravity. You need Kepler's Newton's first law, the law of inertia, by Galileo, but is wrong by Galileo, because Galileo says inertia exists only for circular motion. The person who gets it right is Isaac Beeckman, who's a Dutch scholar whose work wasn't really known before the 20th century, but he's Descartes' teacher, and Descartes takes the law of inertia from Beeckman, and Newton takes it from Descartes. Galileo is not there involved in that, but Galileo is right that inertia is very important because it says, why do things move? And Aristotle says things move because you push them.
And inertia says they move because they're already moving.
They move because they're already moving, and in fact, you have to stop them moving. The law of inertia says if something is moving, it will continue to move until something stops it moving. You reverse the process. This is a very important step.
Two questions. Why is Galileo so regarded? Is this a Protestant Catholic grudge match? Number one question.
No. There are two things. The first is the fact that Galileo is probably the most brilliant scientific polemicist that ever lived. His books are incredibly readable. They're wonderful. They're brilliant. The man was a genius. He is a literary genius. And the history of science was originally written by philosophers. And they love Galileo. The same thing happens with Francis Bacon. Francis Bacon is actually a really bad scientist. But everybody loves him because he writes really brilliant books. New Atlantis, all the rest of it. Galileo writes the most beautiful polemics. Kepler is unreadable. Kepler is a disaster. Copernicus. Galileo writes brilliant polemics, and people like them. People love them. Il Saggiatore is a brilliant polemic. It's scientifically wrong. Dialogo is a brilliant polemic. It's scientifically wrong, but it's brilliant. Yeah? Discorsi is a wonderful polemic. Yeah? He writes beautiful polemics. That's the first thing. And the second thing, he got persecuted. He's a victim. And at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, you get this thing of up until then, Galileo doesn't really play a very major role in history of science. Newton doesn't quote Galileo. Newton only quotes Galileo in terms of the laws of the parabola law, which is if something is thrown, it travels in the parabola. Yeah, which was also proved by Harriot and earlier by Benedetti. It's not original to Galileo. It's something that's not really original to Galileo, but he's the guy who sort of marketed it. He proved it separately for himself, although Delamonte actually probably proved it together with Galileo. He's one of his sponsors, mathematical sponsors. So the physics of the 17th century are based on Galileo, but a lot of other people like Beekman, Simon Stefan, who gets ignored, and so forth, actually contributed just as much, if not more. Newton hardly mentions Galileo at all. It doesn't play a major role in Newton. Just the parabola law, and that's it. Descartes is Newton's major source, and Descartes gets his stuff not from Galileo, but from Isaac Beekman, and develops it himself. So you've got this thing, and it's really at the end of the beginning of the 19th century that you get this whole thing about the church persecuting Galileo, and he becomes the sort of scientific hero. And this gets really the Draper-White hypothesis in the 19th century, two American scientists, philosophers of science, who propagate this thing that there is a war between religion and science, and Galileo is the number one witness for the prosecution.
Right.
The church by persecuting Galileo, make Galileo the person he is. And this is not to deny that Galileo was a brilliant scientist. He was a brilliant astronomical observer. He was a brilliant mathematician. Although there are people who disagree on Kepler was a much better mathematician, much better. Kepler actually contributed more to modern science than Galileo did, much more. But he doesn't get the credit that Galileo does. Galileo is this superstar figure. One, because of Siderius Nuncius. He published. Yeah. His competitors didn't. Simon Marius published 4 years later and got accused of plagiarism. Galileo superstar in his own lifetime because of the Siderius Nuncius. He then becomes a scientific superstar because of the persecution of the church.
Yeah.
He actually made serious and important contributions.
Well, this was my second question. Is he a giant or is he a great man? Is he a significant figure? Where do you...
He is one of the significant astronomer physicists of the early 17th century, but he's only one of.
Yeah.
If you look at the work of Simon Stefan, a lot of it is, in terms of physics, is more advanced than the stuff Galileo is doing. If you look at the work of Harriot, which unfortunately didn't get published, so it doesn't have an influence, it's much more advanced than the stuff that Galileo is doing. Astronomy, Kepler is far, far more important. The fact that that Galileo, the best evidence that existed in 1630 for heliocentricity is Kepler's three laws. Galileo ignores them completely. He doesn't want to know.
Interesting.
It's competition. He wants the credit. He wants to be the man. Yeah? Galileo has an ego the size of a 30-ton truck, and it's out of control. That's why he gets into trouble. It's why he gets into trouble with the church.
He really doesn't need to get into trouble with the church, right? Because he has a lot of friends there.
Yeah, he could have. If Galileo had been more, people would say, why? If Galileo had been more diplomatic, he would never have got in trouble with the church. And people would say, why? Why should he be diplomatic?
He didn't even need to be diplomatic. He just needed not to be openly offensive.
Yeah.
Which the two-world system, I don't know if this is fair, but he kind of, I think I read somewhere that the role of the Pope, is made out to be something of a simpleton.
Urban gave him it doesn't matter what the philosophers say. God can make and do what he likes. It's actually a lot more philosophical and complex. And told Galileo this has to be in the book. And he puts the words into the mouth of the Ptolemaic, defender of the Ptolemaic system, who is called Simplicissimus, the simpleton.
Yeah.
Whether the story is that Urban was insulted by this, this is hearsay. There's no proof of that. But it wasn't a diplomatic move. It wasn't a clever move.
But it's almost he's just too pleased. He's too pleased with his own cleverness, is my feeling.
Galileo is incredibly pleased with himself all the time. He loves putting people down. In the early days, his major Aristotelian opponent was a man called Coulomb, which is Italian for pigeon, and he called them the Pigeon League. He only referred to them as the Pigeon League. Galileo is a brilliant wit polemicist.
Yeah.
Kepler is deadly serious. Kepler doesn't have a sense of humor. Kepler is deadly serious. A much better scientist than Galileo, a much better mathematician than Galileo, a much better astronomer than Galileo. But he can't get it across.
Yeah.
As I say, Galileo completely ignores Kepler's three laws, which are the best proof that exists at the time for heliocentricity. So, you just sort of look at it and think, why? he rubbishes Tycho in the Dialogo. He goes for Tycho, he goes for his jugular, which Kepler got really upset about that because he liked Tycho. And Tycho had been his boss for a year. And he gets really, and he also, and Kepler uses Tycho's data. So I mean, this is he thinks Galileo is being very, very unfair. He's just sort of, Galileo was full of himself. It's the best. He was really, his whole life he was full of himself. He got thrown out of Pisa. He was professor because he took the piss out of other people. He sort of, nobody liked him.
That's a great line to end it on. Nobody liked him. He was full of himself. I think we've done enough. Tony, what I have to ask you is that, today we've covered some time. We've gone on a bit, and it's been absolutely fantastic, and we've covered a very small part of your, what I call your big project. We call it a blog, but it's something much bigger than that. Have you thought about sort of constructing it into something in literary form?
There is basically what I've been talking about today, a sketch of. I have a blog series which is 52 blog posts, which it runs under the title of The Emergence of Modern Astronomy, a Complex Mosaic, which was conceived from the very start to be turned into a book. I was intending this summer, I finished it beginning of this year. As I say, it's 52 blog posts. It needs to be turned into a single manuscript. It needs to be rewritten. Things need to be added. Some things need to be changed. Apart from anything else, the writing still changes. It was written over 2 years, longer than 2 years. So it sort of, I need to rewrite it. And I was intending to do that this summer, but a lot of things, apart from health problems, got in the way. I may, in the next couple of weeks, I may actually produce the master manuscript, which is putting all 52 things together with a couple of other things. Because at times I just sort of, things I'd already written blog posts about, I sort of said, I'm not going to write about it here. that has to be added in and so forth. It's somewhere between 80 and 100,000 words.
So what's that in terms of size of a book?
It's a decent sized book, and it's meant to be popular, and it covers history of astronomy from 1400 up to Newton, and then goes on to the proofs of diurnal rotation and of the orbit around the sun. The orbit around the sun is proved in 1725 by the discovery of stellar aberration. Diurnal rotation is first proved in 1851. Believe it or not, yeah, they didn't have the proof. Yeah, 1851, Foucault's pendulum is the first empirical proof of diurnal rotation, and it's been accepted long before that.
Right. But now, how do you know?
Empirical scientific proof of diurnal rotation, the first one, 1851, Foucault's pendulum. Yeah, which is very famous. People go to Paris and look at this thing. And what it is you can show that if you have a big enough pendulum, you can show that the Earth rotates. The pendulum doesn't go back and forth; it travels around the circle, the circle travels around the pendulum.
Right.
So that's proof of diurnal rotation. So I go up to there, which is basically we start. Where do they start? Around 1400, people start asking questions about the existing astronomy.
Right.
And the final proof of heliocentricity is Foucault in 1851. So I cover this whole spectrum on a popular level.
Well, your blog, it's very readable. I don't know if you're making it, even more straight.
It's written in the blog style.
Well, I think that's great.
And what I've decided, if I can find a publisher, what I've decided, it's in slices. And the slices are between 1,500 and 2,000 words long. Some of them are a bit longer, depending on the topic, depending on the subject. Is I would like to publish it in the same form so that people can read a bedtime story, another bedtime story. There is a book from Eric Quackel on the history of the book, which is written in this style. He wrote it as a blog post and then published it. And it's great because it really does work. You can do this. Instead of writing long chapters, you write little sections.
Right.
If I can find a publisher who would be prepared to accept that, then I would do that.
Well, I hope so.
I've started a second one, which I'm now up to number 17. I'm writing 17 at the moment, on Renaissance science, which is there such a thing as Renaissance science? And if there is such a thing as Renaissance science, then how does Renaissance science differ from medieval science, and how does it differ from modern science? Because it's the bridge between medieval science. You start with the humanist Renaissance, which is a non-scientific thing. So is it okay to talk about Renaissance science? Because the Renaissance itself is a literary movement and not a scientific movement. And then to show there is a produced by this thing of the Renaissance humanists going back to antiquity, bringing new translations, new versions of Greek and Roman books onto the market, rather than the Arabic translations which have been translated from Greek into Syriac, from Syriac into Arabic, from Arabic into Latin, and are corrupt and all the rest of it. Going back to original sources, representing, finding sources that haven't gone through this translation process, which I know the one at the moment I'm writing about is Ptolemy's geography, which wasn't one that got translated from Arabic into Latin in the 12th century. Mm-hmm. Most of the stuff like Ptolemy's Almagest, the Tetrabiblos and so forth were translated in the 12th century. The geography got ignored, whatever reasons, Geographia in Latin, and first gets translated in 1406, and very much as part of the humanist Renaissance. It is a new Greek text which has been rediscovered and has been translated and has a massive influence on mapping and map making in the Renaissance. And you get this explosion of a new approach to mapping, which is triggered by this book. And not just that, there are other things come into it.
It's so sad we don't have any maps from the ancient world. Well, not really to speak of.
We do.
We got the Peutinger table.
What we have, and this is the fascinating thing on Ptolemy. Ptolemy wrote a book about how to draw maps. And it also involves how to do map projection and all the rest of it.
Really?
And then it has a gazetteer of, I've forgotten how many years, but literally a couple of thousand. The longitude and latitude of places and geographical features in the ancient world. The question is, did the original, in the 2nd century, did it originally have maps or didn't it? And there's disputes about this, but probably it did. And certainly the oldest Greek manuscripts that we know are from the 13th century, and some of those do have maps. And you can, when it reappeared in the 15th century, it gets printed very early. The first printed edition is 1477. And I think the Gutenberg Bible is 1450. So you're in the 20 year. The early books are almost all religious and so forth.
Yeah.
But there is a printed edition of Ptolemy's Geographia 1475 without maps, and there's one in 1477 with the maps recreated, and there's a new one in 1482 with the maps recreated, and there are then 5 more editions before the end of the 15th century with the maps recreated. So we do have these maps from antiquity. They are Ptolemy's maps.
Fantastic.
And what happens is that people start updating them and adding new maps.
Yeah.
The maps are wrong. You have the oikomene. This is basically Asia, Europe, and North Africa, which is the world that Ptolemy knows. His oikomene is much too long. It occupies much too much of the globe.
Okay.
This is one of the reasons why Columbus got his whole thing wrong, because
I was going to ask, because I was very puzzled, because Ptolemy seems to make the globe too small, but I thought the Greeks knew how big the world was.
The whole thing is because Eratosthenes produced this measurement of the globe, which, depending on which length you take for the stadia, is within a reasonable percentage of accurate. Everybody says, well, the Greeks knew. There are actually, from the Greeks, there are various estimates, and nobody knew which one was right. Nobody knew whether Eratosthenes or Ptolemy or Strabo or whoever was right.
Right.
There are different values.
Yeah.
Columbus took the wrong ones. He took the wrong value. He took the wrong value for the size of the globe, and he took the wrong value for the size, for the length of the oikomene, which meant the distance between one end, the European end, and the Asian end, on his reckoning, was much too small. He thought you could get from there round to there by sailing in one go. If America hadn't been in the way, he would have died.
Well, Magellan damn nearly did, right?
Magellan did.
Well, he did. That's true, but yeah, he did.
He didn't make it.
He did die. That's true, but
I've forgotten how many ships Magellan had, but only one ship and sort of 20 of his sailors actually made it.
That's right.
And it was one of his pilots who is credited with being the first person to circumnavigate.
Elcano.
Actually, there's a whole series of false calculations by Columbus. You can recreate. One of the things is one of my readers who is an expert on a lot of this stuff. She points out that actually Ptolemy gets most of his stuff from the Persians.
Oh, really?
And the Persians did an incredible amount of surveying on determining the latitude and longitude of places and all the rest of it. And their stuff gets lost, but it is preserved by Ptolemy. And the same thing happens with Ptolemy's the Almagest. A lot of the data in the Almagest is not from Ptolemy. It's old data. This is from Hipparchus and other people.
Which makes sense, right? Because there's such a lot there for one person.
He preserves it.
Yeah.
The problem by him preserving it is he produces these incredible books. And everybody says, well, we got the definitive one. We don't need the other ones. So the other ones get lost. They have Ptolemy's Almagest or they have Ptolemy's Geographia. What's the point of having the other stuff?
Yeah.
Because his is the more advanced and the more complete one. So the other stuff gets lost. A lot of the stuff we know about pre-Ptolemaic astronomy is only because he mentions it.
Yeah.
And the same thing happens with sort of Eratosthenes. All our accounts of Eratosthenes come from much, much later. We have no original accounts at all. So whether he did or did not measure and how accurate is all very dubious. It's
a great story, though.
It's probably true. And he did exist, and he was and it's probably, according to Ptolemy and according to Strabo, Eratosthenes is the person who invents the latitude-longitude system, the coordinate system. Whether this is true or not, because the Persians use something similar. So it's a lot of fun. I love digging this stuff up and sort of looking at it and trying to work out how much of it is genuine. Trying to one of the things is getting beyond the superficial myths. Carl Sagan, very famously, Carl Sagan says, like when he talks about Eratosthenes and his measurement of the Earth, he says he proved that the Earth was a sphere. He didn't. Eratosthenes' whole work is based on the fact that he assumes the Earth is a sphere. Yeah.
Yes.
He assumes it, and therefore he can measure it. He doesn't prove it, and nothing he did proves it.
Tony, are you available to come back for another podcast? Because it seems to me like we've done Galileo, but it seems to me there's other subjects. Would you in a couple of months, if you've got time?
No, assuming that I'm still healthy and still alive, yeah.
I would love to do that.
I will point out my next birthday is my 70th birthday. So when I say if I'm still alive, my brother died a week before his 70th birthday. So I'm reasonably fit.
You look
but
reasonably
the way it's looking at the moment, I'm probably going to have a spinal operation, which does have a certain risk that I might not be alive at the end of it.
Well, I wish you the very best of luck with that.
So we'll see what's coming out of that. To a certain extent, I started all of this very late in life because I dropped out of university twice. And sort of only when I started blogging, which was 12 years ago. When I started blogging, I got this sort of lifetimes spent wasting my time studying the history and philosophy of science. And sort of the last 12 years, I've been vomiting it out.
Yeah, but it's fun. I mean, the blog is I don't know if there's anything else like it out there, but I've certainly not seen it.
When I started, when blogging was much more popular, there were things I would compare it to and things I would say were better. You spend your time saying, "Oh, I wish I could do that. I wish I could write like him. I wish." I think everybody does. I suffer from imposter syndrome, but almost everybody who I used to know and with whom I used to communicate and all the rest of it has stopped blogging because most of them are academics who then get jobs and don't have time. And so people like Will Thomas and various other people, they don't blog any longer, and they wrote really good blogs.
Tony, don't do yourself down, mate. Your blog is it's astonishing.
There used to be people who were doing similar things. Blogging has gone out of fashion.
Yeah, it's all podcasts now, mate. It's all podcasts.
I use Twitter as my main publicity thing, and I mostly only follow people who do history of science.
Whenever you retweet something, and funnily enough, I did a podcast with David Rooney, who did About Time, who I know you're writing a review of his book, and he was very, delighted and slightly apprehensive that you're reviewing his book. So
it's my bedtime reading at the moment. It's brilliant.
He's a very nice man as well.
Also, Nuremberg has this incredible history of science in the Renaissance. It was one of the major centers in Europe, in the world. I have a blog post, which was actually a lecture for a conference on Nuremberg as the scientific instrument capital of Europe, which it was.
And why was that? I mean, I've got to be careful here, Tony, because my sister is coming to stay, and I have a horrible feeling because I've had a telephone message from her. I'm a horrible feeling she's waiting downstairs and can't get in the house. But this question, why was Nuremberg such a capital of scientific instruments? What was driving that?
Read the blog post.
Tony, we must end it. So thank you so much for being so generous with your time. I really, really appreciate it.
One of the things that all of my friends and acquaintances will tell you, if I start talking, it's impossible to stop me.
Well, it was fantastic. Well, that's the end of today's show. I hope you enjoyed listening, and if you did, do please join me for the next episode. And if you have the time, please do recommend me to your friends. And a share on social media, and maybe a review on iTunes really helps my guests get the audience they deserve. Goodbye for now.